Not yet, but we're going now. Okay, let's behave ourselves now. Everybody behave yourself. Okay.
Shall I say it
Um,
again?
You can't see me because it's affecting you.
Come in. Come close.
Okay. Tonight, our topic
Stand up.
is going to be, hi, good evening, Irene, good evening, Fritz and Leon and Noach and Joe.
Stand up.
So our topic tonight is the wonderful topic of democracy and how Judaism works. What's the system that Judaism relies on? Now, I'm sure you're probably thinking, oh, I know Judaism and I know democracy. So why do we have to have a discussion about this? So I'm sure you know a lot about this already, but I'm hoping that we will get a better understanding in, well, not democracy as you understand it in Western civilization, but perhaps democracy in Judaism. Give me 1 second. My wife is away tonight, so I might get interrupted by kids, just a pre-warning. Apologies. Okay, so democracy is what most people would consider to be the most accepted way of governance today. Most countries like to think of themselves as democracies. The question is, are people truly a democracy is an interesting question, and what actually a democracy means. So I'd like to discuss for a moment. We'll start off with discussing what a democracy is and the way we understand it. Democracies that we live in are countries where the public, every individual, every adult individual, has the right to vote who the leaders and who the government should be. And then the government will then vote by, usually by a majority of government officials on behalf of the people. And that's the short understanding of how democracy is. And it's understood to be, in today's society, the best system out there. And of course, all Western civilization, also Western countries, go in have democratic systems, but different variants of democracy. Here in Australia, we have a democracy, and America has a very strong democracy. And of course, we know that countries like England and other countries, they all have democracies, but they're all based on different types of systems. So let's focus on Judaism. That's our focus for tonight. Is Judaism a democratic system? The way Judaism works. So I'd like to spend 1 minute, just if anybody wants to say what they think about Judaism with regards to democracy, on the top of your head. If anybody wants to say something, just unmute yourself and say something now.
Can't resist. I'm thinking there's, first of all, the state of Israel. So think of Judaism, we think the state of Israel, and whether that's a democracy. Then there's ancient Israel and how that was run as a, possibly a theocracy, whether that was a democracy. And then there's modern day implementation of Jewish flavors around the world at a below government level, and whether they're democratic. So I guess there's different ways to slice the question.
Okay, so you bring a valid point, modern Israel versus ancient Israel. We will talk about the concept of theocracy and how the modern blends with the current. So we're going to try to focus on Judaism, which the point that you raise about modern Israel makes me it helps us focus. We're going to focus primarily on the way Judaism is understood from the Torah. So how we understand the Torah practice and what Torah understands is the best system, or what's the best system that Torah has placed. What is a system that we have traditionally that has stayed, or more or less, obviously it's evolved throughout history, but what has been the process throughout Jewish history? Okay, Fritz, what did you want to say?
I'd like to say that religion in general is a benevolent dictatorship. God set the rules, and we say, how high do we need to jump? There's no democracy in the essence of a religion, including Judaism.
Okay, yes, I suppose to a certain degree you're right, and some people would call that theocracy. However, what some people call theocracy is going to be different to the way Judaism understands theocracy and the way it's been understood traditionally throughout the generations. The original term of theocracy we'll talk about was actually coined by a gentleman named Josephus, one of the greatest Jewish historians, and he actually termed the word theocracy. And he had a very different understanding to where it's understood today, but we'll get to that in a moment. So let's try to look first at Jewish history for a moment. If you look at, in the Torah talks about the ability to appoint a king. And we know that famously, the Torah says there'll come a time that you will want to appoint Jewish people, will request to appoint a king, and you shall place a king upon you. This occurs several hundred years after the Jewish people enter the land of Israel, that they formally get a king. Prior to that, there's a different type of government system, which I'm not going to really talk about today because it's so to speak, like a temporary system. They come to the prophet Samuel, the Jewish people, requesting a king. Samuel appoints a king for them by the name of Shaul. Okay? Now, that kingdom, of course, is taken over. It's short-lived, the monarchy of Saul. Saul is a great man, but he does particular mistakes, and the monarchy is taken away from him, and it's given to none other than King David. From King David on, the monarchy, the Jewish monarchy, supposedly stays in the lineage of King David. It's given over to his son, King Solomon, Shlomo, who builds the temple, known as the greatest king ever. And then it goes on to other individuals that are all descendants of King Solomon. Of course, we know famously, it has to be, to a certain degree, it has to be accepted by the people. Because we know that after King Solomon passes away and his son Rehoboam takes over the monarchy, there's a split within the Jewish people, and a person by the name of Yeroboam ben Nevat starts a breakaway monarchy of the Jewish people known as the Kingdom of Israel. So that's so to speak, you see that even though King David and his lineage has been appointed to be the kings for all time, that doesn't really last. At least for not all of Judaism. To a certain degree, it does last in the rest of Judaism. Going forward, you see that the Jewish people are split into two camps, and generally monarchy is given from father to son, with small exceptions. There are exceptions. Of course, we know King David was the major exception. He's actually a son-in-law, but that's not the reason why he got it. He gets it because he's a very righteous and great king, but not all his descendants are. But you do see that there's a certain power that the people have, where they actually rebel against King Solomon's son and appoint another king. So that's the one point. That continues all the way through till the end of during the Second Temple era. There's always Jewish kings or Jewish leaders. Of course, we know that when the Jewish people returned to build the Second Temple, of course, we're now in the Temple period, the period that we mourn the destruction of the Temple. So we talk more about them. But when the Second Temple is rebuilt, the Jewish people are building it in the land that they don't have autonomy over. But they still have Jewish leaders. And eventually, after the story of Hanukkah, during the Second Temple era, the leadership, the autonomy of the land of Israel is given back to the Jewish people. They win autonomy over the Greeks, who had won it from the Persians and the previous people that had been ruling the land, Babylonians and Persians, etc. They get it back from the Greeks, who then they appoint their own kings, and those kings actually become the leaders of the Jewish people. Those kings are first the famous Yehuda Maccabee's brother, Shimon, and then it goes to his son, and then the grandson, a man by the name of Alexander Yanai. So these people are acting, they're not from the descendants of King David, at least not father to son, which is what they're supposed to be. They're Kohanim, and the Kohanim are not supposed to be also kings. Kohanim are traditionally not kings, and that's one issue that they have. But then it's given over Alexander Yanai. He's already not a very holy man. Actually, he does a lot of damage to the Jewish people. He calls himself formally the king and the Kohen Gadol. The Jewish people more or less go downhill from there, except for immediately after the era of Alexander Yanai, his wife, who was actually the her name is Shlomtzina Malka. She was the sister of the head rabbi at the time, named Shimon ben Shattach. So she was a very righteous lady, and there's a whole story of why she became his wife. It wasn't necessarily by will, but she becomes the ruler of Israel for 10 years, and we're told that those are the 10 most peaceful years of the Jewish people during the Second Temple era. But unfortunately, after she passes away, her children are more followers of the ways of her husband, and the Jewish people go downhill. Eventually, the leaders of the Jewish people are actually not even Jewish anymore. They're actually Romans or Roman puppets like Herod and the like, till the end and eventual destruction of the Second Temple and the exile from Jerusalem. However, going forward into after the destruction of the temple in Babylonia, the Romans and the other regions, they appoint descendants of the original King David dynasty for people known as Reish Galuta. And we actually still have a prayer for the Reish Galuta, which means the head of the exile. And they had so much like an autonomous position of authority, like a monarchy. So based on what I've said, this is a little bit of a nutshell of Jewish history. What would you think? Does Judaism support the concept of democracy? Do you see democracy in that process? What are your thoughts based on that history? The government, yes or no?
No.
No. Thank you, Noah. I think that's quite clear. Based on that approach, you would see that the way that Judaism works is not a democracy. Now, the truth is that I'm only painting half of the picture, because if you look at Jewish history, you will see that even the worst kings knew that they were not above the law. And this is the difference between a monarchy or a dictatorship as opposed to democracy, what we're going to talk about, or a good democracy, monarchy. You see, Judaism actually has a split in the way Judaism is run. There's the people that make the law, in the law of how we practice our spiritual lives and how we practice the Jewish law. And then there's a law that the king is actually there just to lead the people into battle and to take care and protect the people, and is really a servant of the king, of the people, but he is never above the law. He's never allowed. The people have to pay him taxes so that he can build an army. And he has to make sure that he has the wealth, etc. But he has much more strict, and if he breaks the law, he's just as liable as anybody else. He's never officially above the law. Of course, once an individual has the power of the army behind them, if they don't truly believe in the law, then the law doesn't have much jurisdiction over them besides for God himself. That actually is one of the reasons why the death penalty for certain Torah Jewish religious crimes ended, because the monarchies were no longer imposing them. They were no longer acting on behalf of the Sanhedrin, and that's why they could no longer do it. And sometimes they were actually opposing them, and they became themselves problematic. So what happened? There was one of the worst kings in the first temple era, was a man by the name of Achav. Okay, Achav was an idolatrous, terrible king, and he's famously rebels against Elijah the prophet, and his wife is the evil Izebel, who's not even a Jewish lady. She's the princess of another kingdom. I think it was the Syrian from Syria or something like that. I can't remember. She's an idolater. She gets her husband. She convinces her husband to become an idolater, who's this descendant from the King David lineage. And not only that, she turns all the Jewish people into idolaters. Izebel goes down as being the worst Jewish queen in history, without a doubt. Who takes the worst Jewish king? Well, there's a few candidates for that position. We have quite a few terrible kings in our history. Achav is definitely right up there, but when it comes to terrible queens, Izebel definitely wins. Anyway, what happens with Izebel and Achav is Achav wants a particular field or particular piece of land. Now, he knows that Jewish law does not allow him to have that piece of land. So he tells his wife, sees him one day, that he's distressed. So she says to him, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." What does she do? She goes and she gets false witnesses to claim that this gentleman, the owner of the field, had done something wrong. And then she takes them to the high court, to the Sanhedrin, and he gets trialed in the high court with false witnesses. And based on the false witnesses, this man, the land is taken away and given to Achav. And I believe that he was also got the death penalty. Now, the question is, of course, it's a terrible story that the Sanhedrin believed this man, etc. But the question is, Achav is such a terrible man. Why doesn't he just go and kill the individual and take the person's land? The answer to that is because of this. Even if he were to kill, he's still not above the law. There's still a law of the land. So he has to get false witnesses to get the law to work for him. And what actually, there's different opinions of exactly what his wife did. Some opinions say that he was the next of kin to this individual. So she just made up a story where he did something wrong and therefore got the death penalty and therefore he inherited the land. Or other opinions say that she made claims that he was Moirid B'Malchus. She had rebelled against the king and the lawyers, and some that's a rebel against the kingdom. The king inherits that person's property. So different opinions of what he did. Why am I telling you the story? Because this story tells us a lot about the way Jewish governance works. You see, the Torah tells us something unique about Jewish kings. What's unique about Jewish kings is they have to have two Torah scrolls. One they keep in their house, and the other one has to go with them wherever they travel, wherever they move, every single room that they go into, except for the bathroom. If they're not going to relieve themselves, every other room, they're not allowed to go to another room, not to dinner, not hunting, nowhere. They cannot go to any meeting without a real Torah. Have you ever seen anybody walk around with a Torah scroll? No? Okay. It's not common practice. But a Jewish king has to do that. Why does a Jewish king have to do that? to remind the king and to remind the people that even though this individual has the power to rule an army and to command an army what to do and to also rule the country, he and all of the laws, whatever he can do, is never going to be above the law of the Torah, to remind him that. So yes, he may control the army and he may be in charge of other environmental and agricultural issues, societal issues, but generally even societal issues are not going to be judged, taken care of by this individual. The person or the people that are in charge are the people that are there, that are the scholars of the Torah. So who are the real governments in Judaism? The real government in Judaism is the Torah. As Fritz said, it's a dictatorship, but it's different to any other dictatorship. The dictator in this case is not an individual, it's not a human being. It is the one that authored the Torah. The question is like this. When you look at the Torah, how do you find out what the law is today? If we wanted to discover the law in our society, how do we discover that? How do we find out? And of course, we've learned about this already in some of our previous classes. But to remind you, the way Torah law works is as follows. There's of course, the written Torah, and then there's the explanations of that Torah which are given to Moses, which is part of the written Torah, and also it's given over, the interpretations are given over orally. But it's explaining directly the written Torah. That's the oral interpretation, the way it is. Is that clear? That's the first part of the Torah. The second part of the Torah is making new rules that were not clearly defined in the Torah. And that requires what's called a Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin, so historically the way it worked is throughout history, or at least in the early ages, till even after the destruction of the temple, there was a government body of the top Jewish scholars. And these were people that had been challenged or that had been tested, that they knew all the laws of the Torah, they understood the ins and outs of all the Torah and all the oral Torahs and all the oral teachings. They'd been tested, that they understood, and they had studied everything there was to study on the law. And then they would be appointed, if they had, and they had mastered all the teachings, that they truly understood it, and they were truly trying to only act with the true intention of the law as it was written. These individuals could then be appointed to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was made up of 71 individuals. And those people would decide what the law should be when there was lack of clarity or a situation that had not been clearly spelled out in the Torah. Of course, that's majority of the laws that we have today are things which are not clearly spelled out, and that's why we are giving particular principles which tell us how to interpret those laws and how to discover the law. So therefore, would we say based on this that Judaism is a bit more of a democracy, or would you say that it is actually a dictatorship or a monarchy? What would we call it? Or perhaps there's a different term. Yes, Fritz.
Can I just add a question to the one you just made? Why is it that at the moment, or let's say 20, 30 years ago, you didn't have 71 knowledgeable rabbis as clever as the ones we used to have? People like Rabbi Sneerson or Rabbi Feinstein or Soloveitchik or whatever his name is. How come that we don't have the brilliant people we used to have? Is it a matter of modesty, or is it just even Rabbi Sneerson was not as good as the rabbis we used to have?
Okay, that's an interesting question. The answer to your question is that is a very controversial discussion. The short answer is that once the Sanhedrin was disbanded, it became outlawed by the Romans after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is about 1800 years ago. Some 1800 years ago, the Romans outlawed the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was made up of individuals that had received what is known as smicha, and if somebody was caught to have smicha or give smicha, they were immediately put to a terrible death by the Romans, making it impossible. They killed anybody that had smicha, and if you don't have smicha, smicha is when you receive that test. It had to be a direct line all the way going back to Moses. That went on for some 1500 years. The Romans realized that that was one of the strongest continuities of the Jewish people, and they were trying to uproot the Jewish people, and they thought if they take away the smicha, they would be successful. To a certain degree, they could have been, if not for Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who actually wrote down the oral law in the Mishnah, and then we had the Talmud. But if not for that, the Romans could have been quite successful because that was our secret. There were later on discussions about whether or not, once the Romans had ceased to exist, and of course it was not outlawed anymore, whether they should try to rebuild the Sanhedrin. And it's been a debate that has recurred over time. The most famous episodes of this was just after the time of Shabtai Tzvi, in the time of Rabbi Yosef Cairo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. And most recently, there was an attempt to create a Sanhedrin in Israel I remember, probably about 15, 20 years ago. And they wanted to appoint Rabbi Steinsaltz to be the Av Beth Din. The only problem is that he did not believe that it was the right thing to do, although Av Beth Din of the Sanhedrin would be the head of the Sanhedrin. So if you can't even get the head to agree, then how's it going to work, right? So basically, there was probably a few scholars that thought it was the right thing to do, and most believed that it was the wrong thing to do. Anyway, many people believe that it's something that will only return once Mashiach actually comes. Why? It's a heavy debate. That's the short answer. However, I will point out that that vacuum of the lack of the Sanhedrin gave way for other options, other opportunities within the Jewish world, which mainly meant that there was still, to a certain degree, Sanhedrins. We had the Talmud, which lasted for another 400 years, which ends up taking up the space of the Sanhedrin. So the rulings that are brought or defined based on the Talmud become very much accepted. And then later, great authorities will debate the ones that are not clear or the ones that are not specified within the Talmud. And usually we have a way of coming to some type of consensus of great opinions, historically known as the Achronim, people like the Rambam and the Rosh and the Rif, the Ran, etc. Those are the old individuals. And then more modernly, we have discussions within these great individuals, like Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and like the Rebbe, Rabbi Schneers and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that till this day there's thousands and more discussion ever than before, as you can imagine, as the world has changed more rapidly. And things happen quicker than ever has happened in history. Halacha is facing an onslaught of questions and things that have to be decided. So it becomes a very big question. And the simple answer is that it's generally decided by every time there's a question that comes up in modern times, it will be a back and forth by the most acceptable scholars, biggest scholars of the time in that particular field. And what will eventually happen will come to some type of consensus. And then there will be some individuals that will always try to be slightly more strict. And even if the consensus follows the lesser the more lenient opinion, they will still rely on the more strict, and then you'll have the opposite, that even though they're strict, they'll still use the more lenient opinion, and they both have what to rely on, but this discussion is happening. And I would say that even though we don't have the Sanhedrin, we still have that discussion happening, and there is a certain concept of consensus that takes place behind the scenes, but usually not very much behind the scenes. It's usually done in books and discussions back and forth in different halachic works and discussions that happen. So it's still taking place. Okay.
Thank you.
Hand up now. Irene.
Yes.
Yeah,
Go
Rabbi.
ahead.
I know in Australia and England, I guess, we've got the constitutional monarchy.
Right.
So this is what we follow here, and I guess until Australia becomes a republic, it will remain a constitutional monarchy. So maybe this is what. No, I know nothing about Israeli laws and things like that. So I know it's a democracy, but what kind of democracy? I'm not sure.
Right. So some people would say, if you were to look at the old Jewish, ancient Jewish, so we discussed when I asked the question to start off with, we mentioned, or Joe mentioned, the difference between ancient versus modern. So we've spoken about ancient versus modern right now in our previous question with Fritz. Described how historically in biblical and temple times, the way it went is through a Sanhedrin. And then the monarchy was really there to enforce that, although at times the monarchy was evil and they didn't, and they rebelled and caused lots of problems. But that was not the official, that's not the Jewish model. That's some person taking advantage of their power that they have, going against the Jewish model, but that's not. So the Jewish model historically has been that the Sanhedrin make the law. They are the ones that come up with the law, and the king enforces the law. The king is supposed to himself. One of the descriptions of a king is a person that has great fear of Hashem, great fear of God, because if they do not fear God, then they're going to go against the Torah, right? And that was one of the descriptions. Unfortunately, historically, not all of them were good, and they still had the backing of the kingdom. Now, when we talk about modern Israel is not at all based on the traditional Jewish system, although in certain laws they generally follow Jewish values. Generally, they will try to follow Jewish values, and within Jewish concepts, they do rule often in ways that follows Jewish law. However, very often the whole system in general is not a traditionally Jewish system. It's more of a social democratic system, and that's the way the rules are governed. But with somewhat of a Jewish blend to it, and often with the basis of halacha, like marriage is supposed to be done through marriage is accepted only if it's a Jewish marriage and things like that. Joe, yes, you had a question?
Rabbi, if I may, a question, because like Irene mentioned about like the government's the monarchy, there's multiple levels, there's federal, state, etc., each with its own government. So coming back to Israel and ancient Israel, I think I know the answer, but I want to ask this anyway. How many Sanhedrins were there? How many kings were there at the same time? Was there one Sanhedrin for the entire nation at a time, one king at a time for the entire nation?
Okay, that's a good question. So the answer is that there's always one king and one Sanhedrin, whenever there was. However, there were smaller smaller batei din or beth dins, courts of law in each major city. Had to have a part of the definition of a major city is it had to have its own court of law, which was usually made up of 23 judges. And the difference is they were not there to promulgate new laws, or so it's not necessarily new laws, but to come to new major understanding. They were, when you had an existing law or a debate which related to that particular town, they would discuss it themselves and come to a ruling. But when you wanted to decide on things like things related to the whole of the people, like if that year should be a leap year, or if if something which like a new discovery or something new understanding, new question comes up about, or something related to the king, for example, then it would always go through the main Sanhedrin. So if it didn't relate to all the people, it could be judged locally. And of course, if they themselves did not know the answer, then you would think, if the small court did not know the answer, you would send it up. So Rambam describes the process. You start off with your local judges or your local 3 judges, and if they say no, this is a bigger case, you go to the main bet then of that city. And if they say no, this is beyond us, this is something that has to be decided by Sanhedrin, this is like a major ruling, then they take it up to the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin debates it for however long it takes to get consensus, which they have to have a majority, and the majority varies from case to case. Sometimes it's just a majority of 1, but usually it's more than 1 that's required, sometimes a majority of 2, and sometimes even more than that. But generally, that's the way it works. Okay? So when we look at the concept of democracy, as opposed to the way democracy is within Judaism, you will see something interesting. So I recently gave a class to some of my students in school, and they asked whether or not, so I asked them to interpret, the reason why I thought of this subject, I asked them to interpret a verse in the Torah. And I said, there are 2 opinions on how this verse is explained within the rabbinate, within the Talmud. There's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and there's the opinion of Ben Petura. These are their 2 opinions, and this is how one explains it, how other explains the same pasuk. One of the students pikes up and says, I want to give a 3rd opinion of how I understand the pasuk. Right? I said, that's wonderful, but to be quite honest, you don't really have the expertise to raise your opinion. I'm saying your opinion could make sense, but and he was quite offended by that, because in today's day and age, if he wanted to voice his opinion, like why can't I have an opinion? Trying to tell somebody that you can't have a what? Everyone's entitled to an opinion. I said, you certainly are entitled to an opinion. But if I were to go to court and say, well, you see that law, I want to interpret it like this. Great. Just because you want to, usually you would take an expert and a true scholar that has had lots of experience, has had studied many thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of laws, and is able to have a clarity of mind and knows how to interpret the law properly, and has had the experience to contrast and compare it. You're going to just, you're a little 15-year-old kid, and you decide that you want to make your thing. You're welcome to interpret, and I encourage him to tell me his opinion, but he shouldn't expect that his opinion should hold the same weight, because these individuals that we're quoting, before they gave their opinion, they studied the whole Torah back and forth with all the oral laws, and with all that background in mind, and they were taught how you can study from and how you interpret Sukkim based on the principles that were handed down from generation to generation back to Sinai, which was given by God, who taught us that process. Then he was allowed, then when one of those individuals, those experts that had spent usually at least 30, 40 years studying it, then they had the ability to give their interpretation. Now, once that is done, once you have that concept of these scholars that are absolute scholars, and in order to become accepted as a judge in the high court, you would have to have been a real tremendous scholar of note, that people would be able to ask you on any area of Torah, and you'd be able to see it. I see sometimes secular scholars, and this really annoys me, to be honest, that they take a pasuk in the Torah, and they give well, look at this pasuk. It says over here that that this person was so and so, and this thing was that, and they take a pasuk in the Torah and they describe it totally 100% based on the most literal translation of the verse, and sometimes 5 verses down the line, the explanation to that verse is given. sometimes it's not given till the other end of the Torah. But if you're going to only take a verse face value and not realize that you have to have the entire knowledge of the Torah, plus the oral law, but at least the 5 books of Moses, you would have to have clear in order to give an interpretation. You will never truly be able to give a interpretation. So it's not an offense to anybody. No one should take offense by this. You should actually appreciate it. You know, you wouldn't want to, if you, God forbid, had a medical, an illness, and you had to get a diagnosis or a prognosis. You would not want to go to some guy that's read from a internet news article and say, oh, I looked up and try to come up some type of understanding. You would want to get the best, most experienced and greatest experts in the field to give their understanding. If you're going to ask, the little boy next door what they think, and they'll do a quick Google search. At least today you can do Google, which at least gives the people some knowledge, and a lot of that knowledge is very useful. Never discrediting Dr. Google, very, very important. Rabbi Google, Dr. Google, whoever you want to call him, he's very important. But let's certainly not start giving life-threatening or crucial diagnoses based on that. Sometimes if it's something minute and to get some basic knowledge, you're getting the information from a real expert that wrote the article that you happen to find on Dr. Rabbi Google. That's fine. But understand that the person that's giving that information, if you're going to go look at some like one of these chats, and you got this and you decide, your friend from next door says, I think you should do this major surgery. They have no idea how to do it. You're not going to go to some guy that's never done a surgery to start doing the surgery on you, right? The same thing is with Jewish law. If you want people that have to interpret the law and to have a vote, you only want people that really, truly have experience studying and analyzing the law. Now, is there a concept of democracy within Judaism? Yes. The original democracy is from Judaism to a certain extent, because in the Torah sets up a process which says, number one, no one is above the law. Not even the king, not even the greatest, not even the high priest. As a matter of fact, there's a whole section in Torah about when the king sins or when the high priest sins, and how the punishment is sometimes more severe, if anything. Number two, not only is nobody above the law is only able to be decided based on the majority of experts at that time, or the Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin at the time, voting on it. And if anybody is in any way biased or affected, they're not allowed to vote on that panel. A famous example of this, generally, the king was not allowed to sit on the Sanhedrin, except if there was circumstances. First of all, he was equipped, like King David, who was a very, very a person of tremendous scholarship and knowledge. But anything that related to the monarchy, he was not allowed to talk about. The same thing is with the high priest. The high priest could be on the Sanhedrin, but he was never allowed to rule on anything that he was biased, that he could have a biased opinion on. For example, whether to make a year a leap year or not, because that could affect both the king and the high priest. The high priest had to walk around with cold feet, and he had to sleep on the floor for the days before Yom Kippur. And he would have wanted that that you shouldn't have a leap year, so that could be closer to the summer, so the Yom Kippur service should be easier for him. So therefore, because he may think that while he's making the law whether to add a month to the Jewish calendar, he was not allowed to make the law. He was absolved from it because we knew that he was biased. The same with the king. Sometimes whether to make a leap year or not could affect his wars or affect something else that had to do with his monarchy. He was not allowed. It had to be a purely Torah Jewish law. Okay? Not affecting individuals. It had to be affecting the whole of the people. It was for the whole of the people that were affected. So the original concept of democracy originates from Judaism, but of course democracy changes, where the concept of democracy today is where you have people that are totally ignorant and have absolutely no knowledge about anything are going to vote and decide who should be the next leader. And as we clearly know, very often those leaders themselves are totally ignorant of anything and have action. And the fact that they were voted in by the people, so to speak, has not helped them. I'm not going to talk about who and why. There's some very interesting individuals sitting in certain white and black offices in different places in the world. I don't know how much they really know what's going on. And how much knowledge they have of the law in the countries that they are ruling. But they were voted in by the people. Supposedly the people supported them. We know that the Nazis became the biggest party, voted in as the biggest party by the people. So people, just because the people have the say, it doesn't always mean it's going to be a good say. And very often it's not a good say. So democracy is an okay system. It sometimes works and usually doesn't, but it's usually not as bad as bad dictatorships. That's the upside. It's usually better than bad dictatorships. Sometimes dictatorships have been good. There have been some good dictatorships, and we know that Julius Caesar, who was on his way to becoming a dictator, after one of the reasons why he was killed, he was murdered, is because people thought that he was going to become a dictator, or he was on that way, or he had become a dictator, and the Senate of the Roman Senate didn't want to allow that to happen. But after that happened, it got much worse. They officially turned into a republic, but the later emperors were worse than dictators. And if they would have had it the Julius Caesar way, it probably would have been better. But who could tell? History could only tell. We can only see what we know now. So what's the best way? There's two systems that we want in Judaism. We want there to be a monarchy, but we want the monarchy to be subjugated to the high authority of the Torah. Now you ask me, why the Torah? Why not some other person, some other rulership? If I had atheists listening to me right now, they would say, what do you mean? I don't want to listen to some non-existence God. That sounds like a theocracy. So let me tell you a bit of a background to the concept of theocracy. The word theocracy was originally coined, I believe, by a man by the name of Josephus. Josephus was somewhat of a secularized or Hellenized Jewish individual that towards the end of the Second Temple era, he was a great scholar himself, and he wrote historical books of the time towards the end of the Second era of what hadn't happened, but he kind of wrote on behalf of the Romans. So he joined the Romans, and we're not exactly sure. The problem is why we can't fully trust him is because he was also writing for the Romans. So that if you're writing for somebody in particular, he wasn't always writing for, but generally a lot of his works are accepted by most of his things, unless it contradicts our other texts in Judaism. We would, if the Talmud or something like that contradicts, but very often he correlates what is written in the Talmud and other Jewish sources. And he talks about the way he writes a book, I think, in defense of the Jewish faith. And in that work, he describes Judaism as what he calls a theocracy, where there's God on the top, and the Jewish people have a system, a democratic system of experts that have to vote on their understanding of the Torah. And whoever is the majority of the best way to understand the Torah, they are the ones that decide. It goes based on the majority of experts at the time. But nevertheless, they're trying to interpret one opinion, which is the opinion of God. That's the way he puts it. Now, today's day and age, theocracy has been connected to zealous and extremist type of things. Whenever they talk about Iran and religious people in governments, they talk about theocracies as something terrible. But it is when it's a religion which is a made-up religion. I suppose it's a debatable thing. Anybody could say that another religion's made up. But when a religion is made up and could supposedly be interpreted by any individuals and whoever's the rulers of a particular country, that's when it's problematic. But when it has to be voted on and there's no king pressurizing them to come to a particular ruling, then it becomes a very healthy system. Okay, so there's two parts of our system. There's the secular system, which is the governments, which takes care of the wars and safety and security and things like that. That is the king. And his job is to also enforce the law that is laid down by the rabbinate or the scholars, which is the Sanhedrin. And that Sanhedrin, there's no individual that has the final say. Yes, there's an Av Beit Din or there's a Nasi, a leader, but he has one say just like every other individual in that say. Not only that, his say, often he has to speak last because they don't want other people to follow his opinion. They don't want the other people to vote like him. So they go from the lowest to the highest because they don't want the younger members of the Sanhedrin to sometimes change their mind based on the opinion or vote like the other people if they don't agree with that opinion. So it's very much into the people, the experts understanding it. Okay, so that's the short rundown of democracy in Judaism. So is Judaism a democracy? What do you say?
Another observation, just extending that, is the possibility for any member of the community to aspire to a position of authority, the upward mobility. So in dictatorships, people, once they're in a certain station in life, they're stuck. And they don't have the opportunities. In democracy, one of the values that people interpret with democracy is that anyone can hope to move into a leadership position, that the opportunities are equal for all.
Right.
How does that sit with Judaism?
Well, the problem with that is other people, well, I wouldn't mind if the people that were in that position were just about protecting and whatever it is, governments, but other people that are being voted in, have they been tested and ensured that they are actually qualified for those positions? And the answer is usually no. There's no qualifications to become a politician. It's as Donald Trump had no experience. I'm not saying he was good or bad, but there's definitely very mixed and extremist mixed opinions about him. But here you had an individual that certainly had no expertise when it comes to politics. And the people that would pro him would say that was actually very his strongest part of him. And the people that are against him would say, well, that was his issue. But you would see the same thing about Joe Biden, who, of course, is the total opposite, has been in politics for many years, and say that's his problem. So I'm not saying that experience in that regard is the answer. I would say, what are the qualifications of a leader? So if you're talking about, if we said that people had a law degree, and judges makes more sense, within Supreme Court judges and judges, they first of all have to be very knowledgeable in the law and the Constitution, and they are bound by the Constitution. They're not supposed to be giving their own opinions. A judge is supposed to be making law based on the Constitution. However, politicians in countries like ours in America, to a certain degree, are able to make new laws which are not necessarily based on anything, as long as they don't go directly against the Constitution. That's where the fallacy or the problems begin when it comes to, because are those people in the right position? So when a Supreme Court law comes out, if they're sticking to the direct law and interpreting the Constitution, then supposedly they are qualified for that position. But what makes a politician qualified is an interesting question, right? So Supreme Court is more, but Supreme Court, once again, it's not voted in by the public. Supreme Court is chosen by the politicians or by the president. In America, it's the president, and then they have a particular, the cabinet and the senates senators that kind of have to agree or vote them in. So it's not a real democracy. In Judaism, it's people are voted in. So there's 2 points that I want to talk about that I didn't talk about yet. The one point is that post Sanhedrin times, and historically the last 1,000 or so years, or a couple of thousand years since the temple, with Judaism being more spread out, the way it's worked is in a certain democratic way, where there's usually would be a sort of board, and that board is usually chosen by the members of the community. The members of the community chooses what they call a kehillah, or like a government's board, and that board would then go and choose the rabbinate. And historically, the rabbinate or the rabbi, they would choose a rabbi. The rabbi would be the final say. Together, sometimes it would be, if it was a big town, together with the Beth Din, sometimes 3 rabbis, sometimes 21 rabbis, but generally we generally haven't had 21 or 23 size courts since after the destruction of the temple, except for in Talmudic times. And basically, the final say relies, when it comes to halacha, normally would rely within that rabbi and that the leader of that town. And the kehillah, or the board, so to speak, of the community, their job was they could take care of the needs of the community. But when anything pertained to halacha, the rabbi had veto rights. And the rabbi had the ability to veto any law that he believed. That has generally been a well-rounded and accepted approach, that he is the expert in halacha, and therefore he decides. And sometimes there's not just him. Some bigger towns have more than one rabbi. So that's the way democracy kind of did fall down into Jewish communities over the year. But once the rabbi had made the ruling, that more or less stuck. Unfortunately, there have been cases. The most famous case of a fallout between a community and a rabbi. There's been many, but most famous one, I think, was in Vilna in, I think, the 1800s. I believe there was a really terrible debate between the rabbinate and the community. I can't remember what the conclusion to that story was. But that's the one point that I wanted to mention. The other point I wanted to mention is this. So other countries, like our country and American, it's based on some type of a constitution or a bill of rights or something like that. That's what they have in America. What's it called over here? Some type of constitution that we have. And the constitutions are, in America, the system is very strong. That when they set up the constitution, they gave the rights to people, and the ability to change the constitution is extremely difficult. It has to be voted on by like 75 or 3/4 of the states, etc., etc. However, when it comes to Judaism, what is our constitution? Our constitution is not made, it's not human made, it's written by the creator of all, at least to our understanding, right? Of course, people will say it, there's going to be atheists, I don't believe in God, so who made it? It was made by some old man that lived some 3,000 years ago. I hear what you're saying, but at least we don't claim that it was human made, and human made could be the same person that made the constitution, could be a Nazi. You know what I'm saying? Once it's humans are humans and they make mistakes. But if it's coming from God, then we have to prove it. And we do have our proof for that, the fact that it comes from God, but that's not our discussion tonight. But at least we're saying that it's not a human-made laws, because human laws are going to change from time to time. But God-given laws apply for all circumstances and could see and lives forever. So that's going to be the difference in our constitution as opposed to other constitutions. Okay, any other points or questions?
Yes.
Yes, Noah.
Yes. So I don't know if I like the question so much. Is Judaism a democracy? Because I don't know if the question itself is worded correctly. Because Jewish law is predictated, no matter what. So Jewish law is there, and it's not subject to change by whatever form of government there is. So I think Jewish law has been and forever will be above any form of government. And then whatever form of government comes in to power, it's up to them to make it work and enforce Jewish law. And so I don't know if we can classify if Judaism is any form of government. It's not. It's above any form of government, and then it's up to the government, whatever it might be, to make sure Jewish law is adhered to. So I don't know if it's right to try and classify Jewish law.
So,
I mean,
so the question was not
without-
what is Jewish law. The question was, does Judaism believe in democracy? And the answer to that would be what, based on our discussions tonight?
Well, I still don't think it's a democracy or belief in democracy, because you can make Jewish.
No,
Jewish
so
law
we
work
agree
for-
with you. We agree with you. I think we
Okay.
pointed out right at the beginning. Judaism itself is certainly not a democracy, as is outlawed or as is played out in Western civilization. Certainly is
Yeah.
not that type of democracy. That's clear. But the
Yeah.
question is, what does Judaism say about democracy? Did I answer that question? Maybe I forgot to answer that question.
No, I think you did actually. I think you did in the way that the way the Sanhedrin works. It's obvious that there's definitely room for democracy within Jewish law. Absolutely, but I don't know. I think it's almost a dictatorship, but without the bad connotations. Just in the way that the law is dictated, and anyone needs to make it work.
Sorry, apologies, Noach. I missed out part of what you're saying. Somebody was knocking on my door. I'm going to have to ask you to just in short repeat what you said. My apologies. I heard most of what you said. What was the main?
No worries. I think the point we maybe we're saying the same thing in different ways, but I think that Jewish law, no matter who is in government, of course, there's room for democracy within Jewish law. But whatever form of government there is, when it comes to Jewish law, it needs to be enforced one way or the other, regardless of the form of government, whatever it might be.
Right.
Rabbi, on that very point that Noah made, I've got a question. Earlier we talked about the Sanhedrin and then the smaller the courts in the provincial areas, right, with the lesser number of judges and so on. Did it ever happen, like to your knowledge, that the Sanhedrin would pass some sort of a national pronouncement, but a provincial court would say, you know what, in our area we're going to do something different, and they would modify or go against the Sanhedrin?
No, not as far as I know. But I could tell you that there is an interesting concept which I was going to talk about, but I didn't have time. But it relates to what you're saying. You see, there's two parts to, and we discussed it when we did that whole series about how the oral Torah works. There's two parts to it. One, when it's a law which is based on an analyzation of the Torah law, it's derived from the law, then that's a derivation. So first of all, this also relates to Noach's approach. That's where we have the concept of democracy, the concept of democracy, where how we derive God's law, it can never be a biasing. Like one guy says, oh, I like today we're going to interpret this verse that says homosexuality is okay. And the next day we'll have another person. No, there's always consensus. But the reason why I bring it up, because that's a topic that people always like to say is going to change. But that's the consensus. Yes, you may have one opinion that says it's one opinion, doesn't make a difference. You can never have bias in how we interpret, because there's always going to be based on the principles and majority of how we derive the laws. It cannot change that principle. So you can never have biasing, because in order to do it, you would have to have a majority ruling on a particular case. And you'd never get majority to agree to go against what is the true understanding of the law that protects the authenticity of the law. That's number one, and that connects to Noach's point, which is where we do have a concept of democracy amongst experts of how we interpret the law. Then there's another part to Jewish law, back to Joe's question. Do we have cases of sometimes where smaller courts will go against? If there's a law that is not made, it's called a law mitzad tikon olam. It's a societal law, but not that. That's some Sanhedrin would make a law, but it wasn't because of the way they derived the Torah. That's not the reason why they made it. The reason why they made it is because they saw a societal need for a new law. Then they would clearly specify that this is not a law of the Torah. This is what's called a takana of the Rabbanan. It's like, for example, the law of polygamy was clearly said this is not the Torah law. The Torah law allows people to marry more than one wife, but we're outlawing that law. That's one famous example. Or the law that in order for a man to divorce a woman, he has to get permission from the woman, has to be consent. That's not the Torah law. So these are laws that were not, but just because of the circumstances were made. So there were sometimes, there's one, the most famous case. Now, in order for those laws to stick, the law is, if a law is not derived from the Torah, it's added, it's a societal law. In order for it to stick, majority of Jewish people have to accept it. If majority of Jews do not accept a new law, it falls away. Most of the times when a new law was established, like the law against polygamy, it was accepted, at least within in the countries where they made the law, in European countries, Ashkenazi countries, and that's who it was made for. That stuck. People accepted it. Thank God, right? But in the laws in the countries that we had, for example, there was a law made by Ezra and his Sanhedrin at the beginning of the Second Temple era, that he said that if a person has intercourse or has a seminal emission, then he cannot, the next day, he cannot say the Shema or study Torah until he goes to a mikveh. And he wanted to add that law. People did not accept it. Most people did not practice that, and the law automatically was annulled because people did not accept it. In today's day and age, there's no obligation for a man to go to mikveh. It's a custom. It remains a custom for a man to go to mikveh. No obligation, except for when the temple will be rebuilt, we will have all an obligation. If we want to go to the temple, we'll have to go to mikveh, but not an obligation as it would have been had Ezra's law stood. You got that? So that's how you see the concept of democracy. But the democracy is not a vote. It's basically whether people could withstand the law. And if people are not practicing it, it's understood that it's too heavy for the community and therefore it falls away because you can't place something which is too heavy a burden on the community. Okay, Fritz, you, I think, wanted to say something?
I have a question, but that's for after the shiur.
Okay, I want to go back to Noach's point that he made. About the topic of discussion. Is Judaism, and the answer is that the point is that I never really answered the question, does Judaism believe in democracy? I hinted to the answer, but I never gave the actual answer. Of course, Judaism is not a true democracy as we have it in Western civilization. But what I would say is this: Judaism believes in a concept within democracy. And it is a very different concept. The concept in democracy is one where the top experts and real scholars that truly understand a particular field, they are the ones that vote. And they are the ones that have a say. And based on that, they would have a majority. But that lay people that have no understanding in something should have a say in any particular area in general, except for example, the case I just, the Ezra mikveh case, that is generally lay people or people that are ignorant should not have a say. Why should someone that knows nothing? I have no clue about Scott Morrison or what's that other guy's name? I'm just kidding. I have no clue who these people are and what they truly stand for. Why should I have a say? And I understand the way Australia works and they force everybody to vote. But why am I voting if I don't know who I'm voting for? Judaism does not believe in that concept. And the fact that anybody could have a say, Judaism does not believe in it. You could have your opinion. Everyone's entitled to an opinion, but that should not be the law, and that cannot be forced people. I don't want you, Mr. Ignorant person off the street, telling me how, doing a surgery on me. The same thing should apply to the laws, etc., and all the ways now values and ethics that are decided. They should be decided by real experts. So much so does Judaism say this. Judaism, Torah law, and the Rebbe used to say this numerous times, that when it comes to something which is not a Torah law concept, for example, if it's a medical concept, you have to go to the experts in that particular field, not the rabbis. The medical experts in the field, they should vote on it. If you have a medical questions, go to the top experts and get 3 opinions, Rabbi say, and go on the majority of those 3 opinions, if you have a real big question. And he spoke about this when it came to security of the land of Israel. He said, go to the top, don't ask politicians. Politicians care about what the rest of the works and if they're going to get voted in next time, what's the most popular perspective. Do you want to care about the land of Israel and what's safe? Should you be giving away this land? Should you be stricter with the Arabs, etc., how to deal with them? Then you've got to ask a real security expert. And you've got to make sure that those security experts are not tainted by their own political views. What is their particular, is it safe to give away this land? And the Rebbe was always against giving away the land. And he said, no, the reason why we're giving away, I'm against giving away land of Israel is not because, I believe that the land of Israel is ours, and therefore we have to hold on to because the Torah tells us it's ours. He says that's a true point. The reason why we shouldn't give away the land of Israel is because it's a case of danger, putting people's lives in danger. And all the security experts agree, whether they're religious or not, that giving away land puts more lives in danger. And therefore, the majority, you go based on the majority of experts in the field, whether they're religious or not, and they are the ones that decide. So Judaism believes in democracy, but democracy of experts in that particular field. And therefore, when it comes to Jewish law or any law, it should be the experts in that particular field that are not going to be tainted by their own personal biases. Clear?
Very, and it's a fascinating answer because an issue that affects all of us right now here in the state of Victoria. There's an ongoing tension between the health advice for pandemic. Until recently, it was the chief health officer, Brett Sutton, who would say, this is what we're going to do next. This is how we're going to manage the situation. Questions like whether to wear masks or not, things like that. But then the law in Victoria was changed so that the government can take advice from the chief health officer, but it's no longer binding, and the government can choose to ignore that advice. And so that's another example. I think it's quite relevant to what you just said, because of the tension between full democracy or the democracy of the experts.
Right, but you have to think that is not a clear-cut case. In general, you would be correct. What should be voted on in that case would be the experts in the field, and it wouldn't be one chief health minister. It would be a whole panel of the top experts in the country in that particular field. But of course, you have to understand that by now, when we're talking about rules of a pandemic, whether it's masks or lockdowns, I think we all understand that it's much more at risk than just whether or not the pandemic whether that particular illness gets spread. We're talking about people's livelihood, which could affect people's mental health. And you have to get mental health experts, you have to get financial experts, and all those things play a massive role. So that becomes a bit more tricky. That would be a case where it wouldn't be, you would have to get the experts in the financial field to present what they believe is going to be the impact, and the mental health experts to say what's the isolation impact, and what's going to impact all these rules, and how everything will impact each other. And that's why, and I think that was one element which has always been missed out. And that's why these laws and that become so contentious and so difficult, because it's not a clear medical decision. To shut down a country for a medical reason is not a clear medical. There's much more at play, and that all has to be played. And I don't know how Judaism would work out that is obviously getting the experts in each field to give their opinion, and then you would have to find another way of how we could ultimately vote on what is the most important factor and what's going to be the cost of everything.
Can I mention then a halakhic, a Jewish example separate to that, but it touches on all those same points. So, the debate, if people are not familiar with, about Ben Pekua, for example, about a different type of a kosher meat, which has been quite controversial. And so in debating that and coming up with an answer, it would have to consult experts in all different elements of Jewish halakha, yeah? So not just kashrut of meat itself, but the impact on people's livelihoods, I guess, the impact on maybe home kashrut practice and the practicalities of that.
No, I think it's a clearly halakhic question. I don't see why it's not. There's other things that play into halakha. Sometimes there's a concept of tradition that plays into halakha. If you're going to look at things just on a clearly halakhic perspective, so pen pekua is a controversial thing because there's a halakha that allows it, but then there's also a tradition which we haven't traditionally we don't do it. So therefore, just because halacha allows it doesn't mean that we do it. There's lots of things that are allowed in halacha, but we have become the customer to do it. That also pertains a certain way. So you can't look at everything. Halacha is, once again, you need the top experts within halacha that are going to weigh on all those things. But yes, all those things could play out as well.
Is there another example where there's a halacha about a tradition of not to do?
Yes, thousands. I can't think of them right now, but
Yeah,
thousands.
the Rambam often says that I can't remember exactly the laws, but he often says, but then you have to refer to the laws of the land.
Yeah, he says this is the law, but it follows the minhag hamakom, and you should go
That's
based on the minhag hamakom. There's, I'm sorry, there are thousands of such cases. I don't know if it's thousands, but definitely hundreds. But there's loads of such cases where we go based on it. That tradition plays an important role, even though something is. And then today, a tradition plays a huge role in defining the halakha. That becomes a really important thing. It's a concept in halakha, where it says minhag mevatel halakha. The minhag, the tradition, or the custom, can cancel out a law. Can cancel a law in Torah. How that works is itself, you have to be an expert in understanding how it works to even get to that. So nothing is as black as white. And when you're going to take things and just try to start, well, that's why I say it's really important not to just put things black and white and start looking at things the way they are on the paper. You have to always look at a bigger picture and have someone that has a real thorough knowledge of halacha that's going to decide and has seen cases of thousands of cases that have been the 2 days of Yom Tov. The fact of 2 days, that's a clear case of tradition cancels out halacha. Okay, and that's the biggest case. That's the most famous case, but there's hundreds of such cases. Noach and Fritz, I noticed that you may have wanted to say something.
I just want to say bye, Fritz. Sorry, I just want to say bye. Thank you very much. Yishar Koach. Excellent shiur. Toda rabba, Laila tov.
Thank you, Laila Tov. If anybody else wants to go, sorry, we've gone very over time, but there was just a discussion. The shiur itself, we ended a long time ago.
Rabbi, we want to say goodbye as well.
Thank you. Thank
you
Liana
very
Marie.
much. Very, very interesting.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
wonderful night. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Good night.
Bye.
Where is it?
On the right.